Retired General Antonio Taguba, who led the U.S. Army's investigation into the Abu Ghraib abuses, has accused the Bush administration of, quote, a systematic regime of torture and war crimes. Taguba's accusations appear in the preface to a new report released by Physicians for Human Rights. The report uses medical evidence to confirm first-hand accounts of 11 former prisoners who endured torture by U.S. personnel in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Guantánamo Bay. Taguba writes, quote, there is no longer any doubt as to whether the current administration has committed war crimes. The only question that remains to be answered is whether those who ordered the use of torture will be held to account.
The report was published in the midst of 2 days of congressional hearings on Capitol Hill. On Tuesday, the Senate Armed Services Committee held an 8-hour hearing that exposed the role of top Bush administration officials in authorizing the use of harsh interrogation techniques. The committee released a series of previously classified documents detailing how the Pentagon and the CIA transformed the military SERE resistance training program into a blueprint for interrogating terrorist suspects. Committee Chair Senator Carl Levin explained the timeline of implementing the SERE, or Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape techniques, and the role of military psychologists in devising these routines.
On October 2nd, 2002, a week after John Rizzo, the acting CIA General Counsel, visited Gitmo, a second senior CIA lawyer, Jonathan Friedman, who was chief counsel to the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, went to Guantanamo, attended a meeting of Gitmo staff, and discussed a memo proposing the use of aggressive interrogation techniques. That memo had been drafted by a psychologist and psychiatrist from Gitmo who a couple of weeks earlier had attended that training given at Fort Bragg by instructors by the SERE school. While the memo remains classified, minutes from the meeting where it was discussed are not. Those minutes clearly show that the focus of the discussion was aggressive techniques for use against detainees. When the Gitmo chief of staff suggested at the meeting that Gitmo can't do sleep deprivation, Lieutenant Colonel Beaver, Gitmo's senior lawyer, responded, yes, we can, with approval. Lieutenant Beaver added that Gitmo, quote, may need to curb the harsher operations while the International Committee of the Red Cross is around. Mr. Friedman, the senior CIA lawyer, suggested that it's, quote, very effective to identify detainee phobias and to use them, and described for the group the so-called wet towel technique, which we know as waterboarding. Mr. Friedman said, quote, it can feel like you're drowning, the lymphatic system will react as if you're suffocating, but your body will not cease to function, close quote. And Mr. Friedman presented the following disturbing perspective of our legal obligations under our anti-torture laws, saying, quote, it is basically subject to perception. If the detainee dies, you're doing it wrong. If the detainee dies, you're doing it wrong. How on earth did we get to the point where a senior U.S. government lawyer would say that whether or not an interrogation technique is torture, quote, subject to perception, and that if, quote, a detainee dies, you're doing it wrong? The Gitmo senior JAG officer, Lieutenant Colonel Beaver's response was, we'll need documentation to protect us.
The Pentagon's former general counsel, William Haynes, was repeatedly questioned at Tuesday's hearing about his role in authorizing the interrogation techniques. During 2 hours of testimony, Haynes responded to dozens of questions by saying he could not recall or remember details about the process of approving the interrogation techniques. Democratic Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island blasted Haynes' role in authorizing torture.
You said the Geneva Convention doesn't apply, and they honestly asked, well, what does apply? And the only thing you sent them was these techniques apply. No conditions, nothing. So don't go around with this attitude of you're protecting the integrity of the military. You degraded the integrity of the United States military.
A major McClatchy newspaper series investigating the detention of terrorist suspects names Haynes as one of a group of 5 lawyers at the White House, Pentagon, and Justice Department who called themselves the War Council and reinterpreted U.S. and international laws about accountability and the treatment of prisoners. Other members of the War Council included Vice President Cheney's former legal advisor and current Chief of Staff, David Addington, former Attorney General Alberto Gonzalez, former Justice Department lawyer John Yoo, and former Deputy to Gonzalez Timothy Flanagan. Despite the new revelations of systematic prisoner abuse, sanctioned at the highest level of government, of the White House Press Secretary Tony Fratto insisted Tuesday that the administration does not abuse detainees.
I can tell you it's always been the policy of this government to treat these detainees humanely and in line with the laws and our legal obligations.
Well, along those lines, another memo came out suggesting that a senior CIA lawyer, while they were debating this in 2002, said the only sure test for torture is if a detainee dies or not, and said, quote, if the detainee dies, you're doing it wrong.
I don't know who that is or who that came from. I'm telling you that abuse of detainees has never been, is not, and will never be the policy of this government.
Today, we spend the hour on torture. We begin with Mark Benjamin, national correspondent for Salon.com. He covered the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing Tuesday. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Mark, to Democracy Now!
Thank you for having me.
Can you talk about the revelations that have come out over these 2 days of hearings, from the Senate Armed Services Committee on Tuesday to yesterday's House Judiciary Committee?
Yes, I think particularly the hearing in the Senate, for me, and I've been covering Washington for over a decade, was one of the most incredible hearings I think I've ever been to. And the reason why, you had a quote from General Taguba in the lead-up to this discussion, that it was patently clear that there was an organized effort to torture and that it was against the law, and the only question left is whether anyone will be prosecuted. I have to say, it's sort of amazing to say this, but I think he's right. What became painfully clear, I think, in the Senate hearing were two things. One is that soon after 9/11, and there was testimony and documents showing this, officials from Washington, not interrogators out there in the field, were calling, you mentioned the military SEER school. Officials from Washington were calling SEER school. We're talking about CIA officials.
We have just lost that feed for a minute, but he's back. Go ahead, Mark. Continue.
Okay. What the hearing showed in the Senate was that officials from Washington, from the CIA, and from the Department of Defense were calling the military SEER school, asking for how we train at SEER school, the Search, Evasion, Resistance, Escape School, how we train elite soldiers at SEER school, and whether those techniques could be reverse engineered into interrogation techniques. Now, that's important. And the reason why it's important is because at SEER school, what we do to the elite soldiers is in some cases, they go through waterboarding, they go through sensory deprivation, hooding, forced nudity, humiliation, slapping, that kind of stuff. The same things you saw at Abu Ghraib. That school is designed to train soldiers in case they are captured by an enemy who violates the Geneva Conventions. The reason why that's important is because at that time, the violating the Geneva Conventions is against the law. So you have high-level officials from Washington asking about techniques that are designed to help people in case they're tortured by somebody who violates the Geneva Conventions. So that was one thing that came out in the hearing that was just incredibly shocking. The other thing that came out that I thought was sort of amazing was that as the Pentagon, for example, started putting together its first formal protocols of using these techniques to interrogate people, in other words, the first memos from Secretary Rumsfeld in late 2002 saying, this is what we're going to do to people, we're going to do hooding, we're going to do forced nudity, so on and so forth, sensory deprivation. Before that memo was even signed, all of the branches of the military, the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army, all wrote memos before that was even signed saying, this looks like a problem because it's against the law. And I just never seen that or never heard that. And what it suggests, obviously, is that high-level, very, very high-level people in the government knew or should have known that what they were doing was against the law. It was sort of an amazing, amazing hearing.
And also about the role of the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Myers, in terms of his response to the criticism he was getting from down the ranks and how he dealt with the Defense Secretary Rumsfeld on this issue.
Yeah, that was also an amazing part of the hearing. What happened was in late 2002, while the military was preparing to formally embrace these techniques and memos saying this is how we're going to interrogate people at Guantanamo and elsewhere, As I said, the military services were saying, don't do this. It's a bad idea, it won't work, and it's against the law. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Richard Myers, has his own attorney, Admiral Dalton. And Admiral Dalton began a legal review, said, wait a minute, let's do a legal review. The services are having a problem, and started a formal legal review of this process. Because of a request from Jim Haynes, who's the Department of Defense General Counsel, worked directly for Rumsfeld, Haynes went to Dalton and said, stop the review. In other words, put a halt to it, muzzle the services. And what was sort of amazing, which came out in the hearing, is Richard Myers agreed and told his own lawyer, Admiral Dalton, to stop the review. And, you know, it looked pretty awful in the hearing, because you could certainly make an argument that if Richard Myers hadn't done that, maybe this all wouldn't have happened.